Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 109 called Climate, Plague and Catastrophe. The first 4 decades of the 7th century AD witnessed the fastest and most dramatic change in the history of the ancient world since Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BC. In just 20 years, in the 2 decades between AD 620 and 640, Islam rose from nowhere to become the leading superpower in Western Eurasia. However, historians have never been able to explain Islam's rapid rise to power as convincingly as they have done with Alexander the Great's conquests. But the answer, or at least part of it, may lie with something that historians are only just beginning to understand, for it's become evident that Islam's early history coincided with a series of natural catastrophes that by themselves were transformational. These comprised the coldest period of weather in human history since the end of the last ice age 12,000 years ago, a period of climate history now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted from AD 536 to around 660. It's highly likely this caused the first great bubonic plague in human history, the so-called Justinianic Plague. Historians have never been able to dimension the effects of this plague, but it's quite possible it killed around a third of the population of the Roman Empire, and a similar percentage in Persia and even in the barbarian kingdoms of the West. However, one place it didn't strike was Arabia. Now, it doesn't take a genius to suggest that should be part of the reason why Arabia was in a relatively stronger position vis-à-vis Rome and Persia, both of which were devastated by the plague. And most historians accept that. But in this and the next episode of this podcast, I want to go further and suggest it wasn't just the absence of plague that helped the Arabs, but the cooler climate was also positive for Arabia since it made it wetter and more agriculturally productive. Indeed, this could have led to population growth, which spurred the Arabs to expand just as much as their newfound religious zeal did. But before we get to that, let's remind ourselves of the natural catastrophes which shook most of the world outside Arabia, starting with the onset of a volcanic winter in the year 536. We discussed this at length in episode 87, so I'll just give us a brief recap of the main points. In that year, people in the Northern Hemisphere, from Constantinople to China, noticed the sun was dimmer and the temperature was cooler. Writing in Constantinople, the Roman aristocrat Cassiodorus recorded, quote, "We see a kind of sea-coloured sun. We're puzzled that physical bodies lack shadows at midday, and that in summer the strength of the sun's rays seems cool." End quote. Procopius, our leading source on the Emperor Justinian's reign, was in Africa in 536, where he was shocked, quote, "It came about during this year that a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the entire year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not such as it is accustomed to give out." End quote. Another Roman writer, John Lidus, a civil servant, noted that the sun was dimmed by dark clouds in summer in a way he'd never seen before, quote, "so that it didn't come into our sight or pierce this dense substance of the clouds." End quote. So, what was causing this strange phenomenon? Ice core analysis has shown significant sulfate deposits in the year 536, which most likely came from volcanic eruptions that year. Using a mix of evidence from ice cores and tree rings, geologists now believe there was a volcanic winter over 536 to 537, caused by an exceptional series of volcanic eruptions around the globe, extending possibly from Papua New Guinea to Central America and to Iceland. This was followed by another major volcanic eruption in 539 or 540, probably followed by yet another in 547. Together, these made up the most spectacular period of volcanic activity seen in the last 10,000 years. For example, much more significant than the major volcanic eruption of modern times, which was at Krakatoa in 1883. Enormous amounts of dust and debris were thrown into the atmosphere, creating a so-called dust veil event, which blocked out the sun's light and warmth in exactly the manner described by our Roman sources, and it's estimated this caused summer temperatures in Europe to cool by as much as 2 to 3 degrees centigrade, with similar drops probably experienced elsewhere around the world. But the volcanic winter of 536 was only the beginning. Recent research suggests its initial impact was extended by a century and a half until the 660s, due to two factors. The first was a feedback loop from the drop in global temperatures as sea ice expanded. The second was a pure coincidence and seems to have lain with a deep decline in solar output, detected only recently by climatologists studying beryllium isotope records. The sun's rays cooled quite independently of volcanic activity, almost certainly due to increased sunspot activity, the volatility of which is poorly understood by scientists but is recognised to fluctuate in cycles measured both in the short term, in terms of decades, but also in the longer term by millennia. So, what was the effect of this period of global cooling? Well, one point which I want to explore in the next episode is that different parts of the world were affected in different ways. For example, the very hottest parts of the globe may have benefited from lower temperatures, but in other areas the effect was probably catastrophic, and we have extremely powerful evidence for this. For example, Procopius has left us with a vivid description of the famine he witnessed in Italy in the late 530s, in the years immediately after the Dust Veil event, when he was on campaign there with Belisarius, and there were widespread harvest failures and famine. He describes villages and fields empty of people, so many had starved to death. He heard stories of cannibalism, and he was shocked by the skeletal appearance of people reduced to eating grass. And this wasn't confined to the territories of the Roman Empire. Across the entire northern hemisphere we have records of a weaker sun, lower temperatures, harvest failures and famine. We find written records of this in places as far apart as Ireland, where there was apparently a catastrophic shortage of bread, to China, where records say that yellow dust or ashes rained down from the sky and there were bitter unseasonal frosts ruining crops, and to Japan, where there were also records of famine. In short, the late antique Little Ice Age was a global event with global implications. And this leads us on to our next point, which is plague. It's unlikely to be mere coincidence that within 5 years of the Dust Veil event, the first serious pandemic in history devastated the global human population, especially that within the Roman Empire. This was the first bubonic plague in human history, the Justinianic Plague, which appeared in the summer of 541 at the Egyptian port of Pelusium, at the junction of a canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. In the 6th century, no one knew what it was or where it came from, other than as a sign of God's punishment. But today we know it was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, which was identified as such in 1894 by Alexandre Yersin, a bacteriologist from the Pasteur Institute. This same bacterium was at work in both the Plague of Justinian and the Black Death in the Middle Ages. It can fatally infect the bloodstream of mammals, including humans, and can kill humans in just 5 to 10 days. Over half of those who contract it are likely to die. Modern antibiotics can kill it fairly easily, rendering it harmless in the modern world if treated quickly enough. But in the 6th century, it was deadly. Symptoms included, and still do, fever, headache, chills, weakness, and most strikingly swollen, painful lymph nodes, typically in the armpit, neck or groin. These became black tumours or pustules known as buboes, the appearance of which gave it the medieval name Black Death, although the Romans never used that term. And the bacterium still exists, and between 1970 and 2020, for example, there were 496 cases reported in the United States, although today it is mainly confined to sub-Saharan Africa. So what was the link, if any, between global cooling and the outbreak of plague? Well, why did the outbreak happen in 541 and not before? And the answer is complicated by the fact bubonic plague had existed for a long time before 541. Medical scientists are fairly certain that its origins can be traced back at least around 7,000 years. Yersinia pestis is thought to have split off from an ancient disease known as pseudotuberculosis, and by the Bronze Age there's evidence it was widespread in the rodent population of Central Asia. Transmission of the disease from rodents to other mammals, including humans, was most likely done via fleas and other blood-sucking parasites. But it's not just fleas that spread the disease. It can also be transmitted through the atmosphere via aerosol droplets or by eating infected animals. So the big question is, if bubonic plague had existed for such a long time, why hadn't there been a pandemic before it hit the Roman Empire in 541? The short answer is that we don't know. However, possible reasons are that those humans who first came into contact with Yersinia pestis, who would have been the steppe nomads in Central Asia, had time to develop immunity and so avoided the sort of pandemic that struck the Roman Empire. But when the global cooling event of the 530s caused a worldwide food shortage, this brought rats, and the black rat, Rattus rattus, was a renowned carrier of the disease, into closer contact with humans as they tried to scavenge for food. Both the Romans and rats had a strong liking for grain, and therefore rats were more than happy to flood into the abundant Roman grain warehouses that existed throughout the empire. There they met the teeming populations of the Roman Empire, who had no herd immunity and were extremely vulnerable to infection. But why did it first appear at Pelusium? What route had it taken to get there? Again, there's no definitive answer. Most historians think it came from India. There was a booming trade network between Rome and India that had existed since the heyday of the classical empire, driven mainly by the Romans' obsession with Chinese silk and Indian spices. The current scholarly consensus is that rats infected with the plague had found their way from Central Asia into parts of India, where they then travelled on board ships bound for the Mediterranean. But historians are still divided over whether they travelled directly from India to Egypt or stopped elsewhere in Africa on the way. The African theory is prompted by the observation of a Roman doctor, Rufus of Ephesus, that he encountered what sounds like something very similar to Yersinia pestis in the 1st century AD in North Africa, i.e. modern Libya. Other sources also refer to East Africa as a region with a similar disease. But whatever the true origins and course of the plague, by 541 there's no doubt it was a deadly reality in the Roman Empire. In the summer of that year, corpses were piling up in Pelusium, and it quickly spread east to Palestine and then north to Alexandria, the empire's third most important city. By the spring of 542, it had reached Constantinople. The plague's deadly grasp was rapidly spreading like ink on blotting paper to engulf Syria, Mesopotamia, Greece, Italy and North Africa. By 543 it had stretched out to the furthest extremities of Western Europe, Gaul and Britain. while to the east it rose up through Armenia and into the Caucasus. We have some excellent literary evidence for the scale of death caused by the plague in the Roman Empire, which I described in episode 88. Not just Procopius, but John the Bishop of Ephesus have left us with vivid and moving descriptions. John was in Egypt when the plague struck, and he made his way from there to Constantinople, literally in tandem with the route taken by the disease as it spread. Somehow he survived, and he collated an eyewitness account of the plague into a longer work of ecclesiastical history. Unlike Procopius, who only saw the effect of the plague in Constantinople itself, John witnessed it spread like wildfire across the Roman Empire, and his account tells of devastation not just in the cities, but in the countryside, and even in ships at sea found with all their crew dead, like a plague-induced version of the Marie Celeste. John's account is a sobering and moving experience of the suffering caused by the plague, and I'd recommend it to anyone interested in the history of pandemics. The overriding impression is one of horror. Houses became family tombs, quote, houses large and small, beautiful and desirable, which suddenly became tombs for their inhabitants, and in which servants and masters at the same time suddenly fell dead, mingling their rottenness together in their bedrooms, and not one of them escaped who might remove the corpses out from within the house, end quote. Streets were filled with dead bodies, quote, others who perished falling in the streets become a terrible and shocking spectacle for those who saw them, as their bellies were swollen and their mouths wide open, throwing up pus like torrents, their eyes inflamed and their hands stretched out upwards, and over the corpses, rotting and lying on corners and streets, and in the porches of courtyards and in churches and martyria, and everywhere, with nobody to bury them, end quote. There was no escape from the plague. Its deadly effect transformed everything. Warfare stopped. It effectively brought to an end the war between Rome and Persia. Economic activity throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East collapsed. In 542, even the Emperor Justinian contracted the disease. The plague was a turning point in ancient history. As for numbers of the dead, according to John, the plague, quote, began to assault the class of the poor who lay in the streets. It happened that 5,000 and 7,000 or even 12,000 and as many as 16,000 of them departed this world in a single day, end quote. He says about half the population of Constantinople died, and that would have been 300,000 or more people. The officials apparently gave up counting once the number exceeded 230,000. This might have been an exaggeration, but the numbers were certainly huge. Historians can't agree on the death toll, but if the 14th century Black Death killed maybe a third of the population of Western Europe with the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, then presumably there was a similar loss of life in the 6th century. Certainly this would be entirely in keeping with our literary records. But what was the economic impact of the plague? Yet again, this is something historians don't agree on. Common sense suggests it caused a massive fall in tax revenues. If we assume that around a third of the empire's population was killed by the pandemic, then tax revenues would have fallen by a similar or even greater amount, as people were simply not there to pay tax, and the economic collapse meant that even those who survived didn't have the means to pay their normal taxes. One thing we know for certain is that there was a fiscal crisis, since the currency was debased for the first time since the 3rd century AD. Procopius says Justinian instructed Peter Barsames, the head of the treasury, to strike lightweight gold solidi. Our information on this is limited, but it seems to have happened in direct response to the first outbreak of the plague in 542-3, or possibly a bit later in 547. And debasement of the coinage always led to inflation, as had happened so spectacularly in the 3rd century, as we've discussed in earlier episodes. And inflation made trade more difficult, resulting in further economic contraction and lower tax revenues. Inflation was also caused by the high death toll of the plague. Fewer labourers meant those who survived the plague could demand more for their work. And this phenomenon was repeated very clearly during the 14th century Black Death. In Justinian's reign, we have evidence of wage inflation, since we know labourers were paid nearly double the number of bronze coins called follis, and Justinian tried to control this by imposing wage restraints, such as Diocletian had done in the 3rd century. But as Diocletian experienced, this achieved little, since people paid whatever the true market price was by resorting to private black market deals. Another consequence of the high death toll was the abandonment of agricultural land, since there simply weren't enough people to work it. This also, of course, caused taxes to fall. Controversially, Justinian assigned abandoned agricultural land to neighbouring landowners or communities and made them liable for the associated taxes. Not surprisingly, this was deeply resented, and I doubt many people actually paid the additional tax. In short, the plague was an economic catastrophe. As we've discussed in previous episodes, Justinian was already short of cash when the plague hit because of his Western wars and his extravagant building program, and the plague pushed his impoverished state over the edge into bankruptcy. Henceforth, balancing the budget was well nigh impossible for his successors, culminating in the overthrow of the Emperor Maurice in 602. But if the Roman Empire was pushed to breaking point because of plague-induced economic pressures, what was happening in Arabia? How were the unprecedented natural catastrophes of the last decades of late antiquity affecting the population and economy of Arabia? And it's to this subject that we'll turn in the next episode, and be prepared for the biggest surprise of all as we look for the missing link in explaining the sudden and spectacular rise of Islam. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll continue with the extraordinary story of the rise of Islam in a week's time on the 15th of March. And in the meantime, if you're looking for something to watch, check out my new YouTube videos on the fall of the Roman Empire. Link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.